Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something that'll make you question everything you think you know about ancient medicine. Picture this: you're lying on a reed mat in ancient Egypt, a nasty infection spreading up your arm, and the physician walks in carrying moldy bread. Wait, what? By the end of tonight's journey, you'll understand how a civilization that built the pyramids also discovered one of medicine's greatest secrets hiding in their leftover dinner rolls. You're about to learn why Egyptian doctors were prescribing fuzzy, green bread thousands of years before anyone knew what bacteria even was, and honestly, you probably won't survive hearing about some of the other treatments they had back then. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment below with where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing our global bedtime community come together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step through the doorway of an ancient Egyptian medical clinic, and the first thing that hits you isn't the sight, it's the smell. Incense mingles with something earthier, mustier. Your sandals pad across smooth limestone floors as your eyes adjust to the flickering oil lamp light. Shelves line the walls, filled with clay jars, each one labeled in hieroglyphs you can't read. But you don't need to read them to know something unusual is happening here. The physician, a middle-aged man with intricate tattoos marking his medical rank, approaches a patient lying on a low wooden table. The man's leg bears an angry, weeping wound, the kind that meant death in an era before antiseptics. You watch, expecting some elaborate ritual involving prayers to Isis or perhaps a mixture of honey and herbs. Instead, the physician reaches for what looks like a loaf of bread that's been forgotten in a damp corner for weeks. The bread is covered in a fuzzy, blue-green coating that makes your modern sensibilities recoil. Mold. Lots of it. The physician examines the moldy mass with the same careful attention a surgeon today might give to selecting the right scalpel. He scrapes away portions of the mold with a bronze knife, creating a paste-like substance on a small limestone palette. The scraping sound echoes softly in the chamber, mixing with the distant murmur of the Nile outside. This isn't some desperate last resort, this is standard procedure. You realize you're witnessing something that historians still argue whether to call revolutionary or accidental: the world's first antibiotic treatment, happening roughly 3,000 years before Alexander Fleming would discover penicillin in his London laboratory. The patient doesn't flinch as the physician applies the moldy paste directly to his infected wound. In fact, there's an air of quiet confidence in the room, as if everyone involved knows this treatment works. The physician mutters what sounds like an incantation, but you catch fragments that are clearly medical instructions: how long to leave the poultice in place, when to change the dressing, what signs of improvement to watch for. His assistant, a younger man with the shaved head typical of temple workers, nods knowingly and begins preparing clean linen bandages. Around you, other patients wait their turn. A woman cradles a child with what appears to be an infected eye, gently rocking while humming a lullaby that seems to calm both mother and child. An elderly man holds a cloth against a festering cut on his hand, his weathered face bearing the patient expression of someone who's endured harder times than this. A teenage girl sits quietly, her arm wrapped in what looks like yesterday's moldy bread treatment, and remarkably, the angry redness that would have accompanied such wounds seems notably absent. And there, in the corner, sits a row of bread loaves in various stages of moldiness, like some ancient pharmaceutical garden growing exactly the medicine these people need. Some loaves sport the familiar blue-green fuzz you'd recognize from forgotten leftovers in modern refrigerators. Others display different colored molds, yellows, whites, even some with an almost purple tint. Each represents a different tool in the physician's arsenal, though he doesn't yet know the scientific names for penicillium or aspergillus. You're not just observing medical treatment, you're witnessing the birth of a healing tradition that would influence medicine for millennia. The Egyptians didn't know about fungi or bacteria or the complex chemical processes that make certain molds effective against infection. They just knew that when bread went bad in a particular way, it could make people better. Sometimes the most profound discoveries come from the simplest observations, even if it takes humanity 3,000 years to understand the science behind them. The physician finishes with his patient, and moves to the next, selecting a different piece of moldy bread from his collection. Each mold straying, you begin to realize, might be chosen for specific types of infections or wounds. These ancient healers had developed a sophisticated understanding of their living pharmacy, even without microscopes or laboratory equipment. The quirky part? Some of these same mold species would eventually be cultivated in modern pharmaceutical labs, making the connection between ancient Egyptian medicine and your local pharmacy's antibiotic section surprisingly direct. As you observe this ancient medical practice, one mainstream historical fact becomes clear: Egyptian medicine was remarkably advanced for its time, with surgical procedures and treatments that wouldn't be out of place in medieval European medicine practice 2,000 years later. The physicians here understand anatomy, perform complex surgeries, and maintain detailed medical records. Yet here's where it gets fascinating. They're also using living organisms as medicine in ways that modern science is only beginning to fully appreciate again. The evening light filtering through high windows catches dust motes dancing in the air, and you notice how the entire clinic operates with a rhythm that speaks of centuries of refined practice. This isn't experimental medicine. This is an established medical tradition, passed down through generations of healers who learned through careful observation and patient record-keeping that certain moldy breads consistently help their patients recover from infections that would otherwise prove fatal. You find yourself standing in a bustling Egyptian bakery along the Nile, where the humid air carries more than just the scent of fresh bread, it carries the seeds of medical revolution. The year is roughly 1500 BC, and you're about to witness how humanity's greatest accidents sometimes become its greatest discoveries. The baker, a stout man with flour-dusted arms, pulls loaves from his mud-brick oven with obvious pride. Each golden-brown creation represents hours of careful work, grinding emmer wheat, mixing with Nile water, shaping by hand, and timing the baking to perfection. But here's where ancient Egypt's climate becomes both blessing and curse. That same humid, warm air that makes the Nile Valley so fertile also creates perfect conditions for unwanted guests on freshly baked bread. You watch as the baker stacks his finished loaves on wooden shelves, completely unaware that he's about to accidentally launch a medical breakthrough. The mainstream historical fact is that Egyptian bread was the cornerstone of their diet. Workers were often paid in bread rations, and a typical laborer consumed several loaves daily. But what the baker doesn't expect is how quickly his precious inventory will transform in this moisture-laden environment. Within hours, you notice the first signs. A faint discoloration appears on the crusts of loaves stored in the dampest corner of the bakery. By the next morning, delicate wisps of what looks like cotton candy begin sprouting from the bread's surface. The baker's first instinct, naturally, is frustration. Spoiled bread means lost income. But you're witnessing something far more significant than economic loss. The mold spreading across these abandoned loaves isn't random. Egypt's unique climate, with its combination of Nile humidity and desert heat, creates ideal conditions for specific fungal species to flourish. The quirky detail that most people don't realize? The same geographic and climatic factors that made Egypt perfect for preserving mummies also made it perfect for cultivating therapeutic molds. It's as if nature designed this environment to be humanity's first pharmaceutical laboratory. As days pass, you observe the baker's changing attitude toward his ruined inventory. Initially, moldy loaves went straight to the waste pile behind the bakery. But gradually, you notice something interesting. People begin approaching the baker not for fresh bread, but specifically asking for the moldy specimens. Word has somehow spread that these fuzzy, unappetizing loaves possess healing properties. The transition from waste product to medicine didn't happen overnight. Historians still argue whether the discovery was purely accidental or if someone made the connection through systematic observation. What seems most likely is that desperate people, faced with serious infections and limited medical options, tried everything available, including bread that had gone bad. Some of these desperate experiments ended badly, but others produced miraculous recoveries that couldn't be ignored. You follow one such interaction as an elderly woman approaches the baker, pointing to a particularly fuzzy loaf. She explains, through a mixture of gestures and rapid Egyptian dialect, that her grandson has developed an infected wound from a fishing accident. The baker initially refuses. He's not a physician, after all. But the woman's persistence and obvious desperation eventually persuade him to part with what he still considers garbage. The fascinating part is watching how quickly this accidental discovery spreads through Egyptian society. Within months, you observe bakers throughout the region deliberately setting aside portions of their daily production to mold under controlled conditions. They experiment with different storage locations, moisture levels, and bread compositions to encourage the growth of what they begin to recognize as good versus bad molds. The process becomes increasingly sophisticated as bakers learn to identify productive mold strains by color, texture, and even smell. Blue-green molds prove most effective for certain types of wounds, while different colored fungi seem to help with other conditions. This represents one of humanity's earliest examples of systematic biological cultivation for medical purposes, even though the practitioners have no understanding of microbiology. What makes this discovery particularly remarkable is how it challenges our assumptions about ancient knowledge. These weren't primitive people stumbling around in ignorance. They were careful observers who could recognize patterns and refine techniques based on results. The baker you're watching has developed specific timing for optimal mold cultivation, knows which bread recipes produce the most effective therapeutic fungi, and can even predict which environmental conditions will yield the best medicinal results. The economic implications become apparent as you observe the emerging trade around moldy bread. Fresh bread feeds the body, but moldy bread saves lives, and people pay accordingly. Bakers begin specializing in pharmaceutical bread production, developing relationships with physicians and even establishing primitive quality control standards. Some focus on quick-growing molds for emergency treatments, while others cultivate slower developing strains that prove more effective for chronic conditions. By sunset, you realize you've witnessed more than just accidental spoilage. You've observed the birth of biotechnology, the deliberate cultivation and application of living organisms for human benefit. The humid Egyptian air that ruins the baker's fresh inventory also provides the perfect incubator for humanity's first antibiotic production facility. Sometimes the most revolutionary discoveries hide in the most mundane accidents, waiting for someone desperate or curious enough to look beyond conventional wisdom. The irony isn't lost on you. In an age when people worship gods of healing and spend fortunes on elaborate medical rituals, the most effective medicine grows freely on discarded bread in the corner of an ordinary bakery. You're standing in the shadows of a temple healing chamber, watching a moment that will change medicine forever. 3 Egyptian healers huddle around a dying soldier, and what you're about to witness is the exact instant when ancient wisdom collides with accidental discovery. When someone finally realizes that fuzzy, disgusting bread mold can accomplish what generations of prayers and potions could not. The soldier's name is Katie, and he's been fighting a losing battle against infection for over a week. The wound on his thigh, earned during a skirmish with Nubian raiders, has turned the angry black-red color that every ancient physician recognizes as a death sentence. Traditional treatments have failed spectacularly. Sacred incantations to Sekhmet, goddess of healing, produced no improvement. Expensive imported herbs from distant lands proved worthless. Even the pharaoh's personal remedy, a mixture of ground pearls and gold dust, couldn't stop the infection's relentless spread. The eldest healer, a weathered man whose hands bear the stains of decades mixing medicines, shakes his head in frustration. You can see the defeat in his eyes as he prepares to deliver the inevitable news to Katie's family. But then something extraordinary happens, something that historians still argue whether to attribute to desperation, divine inspiration, or pure scientific curiosity. The youngest healer, barely more than an apprentice, speaks up with a suggestion so absurd that his colleagues initially dismiss it as the babbling of an inexperienced fool. He's noticed something during his menial task of disposing of spoiled temple offerings. Bread covered with certain types of mold seems to correlate with fewer insects, and less decay in the waste areas where it's discarded. More intriguingly, he's observed that cuts on his own hands heal faster when accidentally exposed to specific moldy bread residues. The mainstream historical fact here is that Egyptian medicine operated on multiple levels simultaneously, combining practical treatments with religious rituals, empirical observation with spiritual beliefs. What makes this moment revolutionary is watching these healers make the mental leap from observation to application, from superstition to proto-science. The senior healers exchange skeptical glances. Using spoiled food as medicine violates every principle of their training. Clean ingredients, pure substances, blessed materials, these are the foundations of proper healing practice. Applying rotten bread to a wound seems not just ineffective but potentially dangerous. Yet Katie is dying anyway, and sometimes desperate situations call for desperate measures. You watch the internal struggle play out across their faces as they weigh professional reputation against potential breakthrough. The decision to try moldy bread represents more than medical experimentation. It's a fundamental shift in thinking that challenges established hierarchies of knowledge. The youngest, least experienced healer has proposed something that could either save a life or destroy their collective credibility. The quirky detail that most people miss is how this decision-making process reveals the democratic nature of ancient Egyptian medical practice. Unlike later medical traditions dominated by rigid hierarchies, Egyptian healers often collaborated and debated treatments openly. Even apprentices could contribute observations and suggestions, creating an environment where accidental discoveries could be recognized and tested rather than dismissed out of hand. After intense discussion, they decide to proceed with the unprecedented treatment. The apprentice retrieves a piece of bread that's been sitting in the temple's damp storage area for several days, covered in the familiar blue-green fuzz that usually signals disposal time. The senior healer examines the moldy specimen with the same careful attention he'd give to precious imported medicines, noting its color, texture, and even scent. The application process becomes a ritual unto itself. They clean Katie's wound with sacred Nile water, recite protective incantations, and then, with visible reluctance, apply the moldy bread paste directly to the infected tissue. The soldier, delirious with fever and pain, doesn't protest this unusual treatment. His family members, gathered to witness what they assume will be his final hours, watch with expressions ranging from hope to horror. What happens next defies everyone's expectations. Within hours, the angry redness surrounding Katie's wound begins to subside. The foul-smelling discharge that had been steadily increasing suddenly decreases. By the next morning, the soldier's fever breaks for the first time in days. The healers can hardly believe what they're witnessing. A treatment they'd considered desperate foolishness is producing results that their most trusted remedies couldn't achieve. The transformation in the healer's understanding is as dramatic as the patient's physical recovery. You watch them struggle to reconcile this success with their existing medical knowledge. How can something rotten and disgusting prove more effective than blessed oils and purified substances? The conceptual framework that guided their previous practice suddenly seems inadequate to explain what they're observing. Over the following days, as Katie's recovery continues, the healers begin developing theories to explain their unexpected success. Some invoke divine intervention. Perhaps the gods work through unexpected channels. Others suggest that corruption and decay might possess healing properties under specific circumstances. The most progressive among them begins to wonder whether appearance and effectiveness might not always correlate in the ways they'd assumed. Historians still argue whether this represents the birth of experimental medicine or simply lucky accident elevated to principle. What's undeniable is that these healers have crossed a crucial threshold in medical thinking. They've demonstrated willingness to challenge conventional wisdom based on empirical results, prioritizing what works over what's traditionally accepted. The ripple effects of this breakthrough extend far beyond one patient's recovery. Word of the successful moldy bread treatment spreads through Egypt's medical community with remarkable speed. Other healers begin experimenting with controlled rot and therapeutic decay, developing increasingly sophisticated approaches to what they don't yet understand as antibiotic medicine. By the time Katie returns to active duty, completely recovered from an infection that should have killed him, the Egyptian medical establishment has begun incorporating moldy bread treatments into their standard practice. What started as a desperate last resort has become a proven therapy that challenges everything these ancient physicians thought they knew about healing. You find yourself floating through the sacred chambers of Khnum's temple, where the ram-headed god of creation watches over something far more revolutionary than pottery wheels and Nile floods. Here, in rooms thick with incense and divine authority, Egyptian priests are grappling with a theological crisis that would make modern religious scholars sweat. How do you explain that the god's greatest healing gift comes disguised as rotting bread? The head priest, his shaved scalp gleaming with sacred oils, holds a piece of therapeutic mold up to a golden statue of Khnum. The irony isn't lost on you. This god who supposedly shapes humans from now clay on his potter's wheel has apparently been working with an entirely different medium all along. The mainstream historical fact is that Egyptian religion deeply intertwined with medical practice, with most healing temples serving dual roles as hospitals and places of worship. But what you're witnessing goes beyond typical religious medicine into something approaching divine biotechnology. The theological discussions you overhear would sound almost comical if they weren't so earnest. Senior priests debate whether moldy bread represents a test of faith. Perhaps the gods deliberately disguise their most powerful remedies in repulsive forms to separate true believers from the squeamish. Others argue that Khnum, as creator of life, naturally works through living organisms like mold cultures. The most progressive theologians suggest that divine wisdom operates through natural processes, making moldy bread not just medicine but actual physical manifestation of godly power. What fascinates you most is watching how quickly religious authority adapts to medical reality. Within months of the first successful moldy bread treatments, temple scribes begin incorporating fungal therapy into official religious doctrine. They develop elaborate creation myths explaining how Khnum first discovered the healing properties of transformed bread, weaving medical observation into sacred narrative with impressive theological creativity. The quirky detail that most people miss is how this religious endorsement actually accelerates medical development rather than hindering it. Unlike later periods when religious orthodoxy often opposed scientific advancement, Egyptian priests actively promote moldy bread research as sacred duty. Temple resources fund mold cultivation experiments, religious festivals celebrate successful treatments, and priestly training includes courses in therapeutic fungus identification. You observe the development of increasingly elaborate religious rituals surrounding moldy bread preparation. Priests perform purification ceremonies over bread designated for medical transformation, recite specific incantations during the molding process, and maintain sacred cultivation chambers where bread transforms under divine supervision. These rituals serve practical purposes: controlling contamination, maintaining consistent environmental conditions, ensuring proper timing, while providing spiritual framework that makes the treatment acceptable to traditional believers. The integration of moldy bread medicine into religious practice creates some interesting social dynamics. Patients seeking treatment must undergo spiritual preparation before receiving fungal therapy, including confession of sins that might interfere with divine healing, purification rituals to prepare the body for sacred medicine, and offerings to ensure divine favor during treatment. This religious packaging actually increases treatment effectiveness by creating psychological expectations of healing and providing social support systems that aid recovery. Temple physicians develop sophisticated theological explanations for different aspects of mold therapy. Blue-green molds represent Khnum's life-giving power working through earth and water elements. White, cotton-like fungi embody the god's breath transforming ordinary bread into divine medicine. Even failed treatments receive religious interpretation. Perhaps the patient lacks sufficient faith, or competing gods interfere with Khnum's healing work, or the timing conflicts with cosmic cycles that influence divine effectiveness. Historians still argue whether this religious framework represents genuine spiritual insight or clever political adaptation. What's undeniable is that priestly endorsement transforms moldy bread from experimental treatment to established religious practice, complete with official doctrine, standardized procedures, and institutional support that ensures knowledge preservation and transmission across generations. The temple's role in moldy bread medicine extends beyond mere religious blessing into practical research and development. Priests experiment with different prayer formulations during mold cultivation, testing whether specific incantations influence fungal growth patterns. They investigate correlations between celestial events and treatment effectiveness, developing complex calendars that predict optimal timing for different types of therapeutic applications. Some even explore whether blessed versus ordinary bread produces superior mold cultures, conducting what amounts to ancient clinical trials disguised as religious observance. You watch as temple workshops develop specialized equipment for sacred mold production. Bronze vessels designed specifically for controlled bread aging, carved stone platforms that maintain ideal temperature and humidity, even primitive filtration systems that separate beneficial from harmful fungal strains. These innovations emerge from religious devotion but represent genuine technological advancement that improves treatment outcomes. The economic implications of divine mold medicine become apparent as you observe temple operations. Pilgrims travel vast distances seeking Knum's healing bread, bringing offerings that fund further medical research. Wealthy patrons donate resources for temple expansion, including dedicated facilities for mold cultivation and patient treatment. The combination of religious authority and medical effectiveness creates a sustainable economic model that supports continued innovation in fungal therapy. Perhaps most remarkably, you witness the development of what might be history's first quality control standards for pharmaceutical production. Temple protocols specify exact procedures for bread preparation, environmental conditions for optimal mold growth, and criteria for determining when cultures are ready for medical application. These standards emerge from religious requirements for ritual purity but result in consistent, effective medicine that rivals modern pharmaceutical quality control in some respects. The theological framework also addresses practical concerns about treatment failures and side effects. When moldy bread medicine doesn't work, priests explain that divine healing operates according to cosmic plans beyond human understanding. Adverse reactions are interpreted as spiritual purification processes, where the body expels corruption before accepting divine healing. This religious interpretation prevents treatment failures from undermining overall confidence in the therapy while providing psychological comfort for patients and families dealing with disappointing outcomes. By evening, as you observe the day's final healing ceremonies, you realize you've witnessed something unprecedented in medical history. Religious authority, rather than opposing scientific innovation, has embraced and accelerated it. Divine blessing transforms experimental treatment into established practice, while spiritual framework provides psychological and social support that enhances therapeutic effectiveness. Knum's ram-headed statue presides over what might be humanity's first successful integration of faith-based and evidence-based medicine, proving that science and religion can sometimes collaborate rather than compete. You're lying on a reed mat in the sweltering heat of the Egyptian desert, and your leg feels like it's hosting a particularly aggressive dinner party for every infectious organism within a 100-mile radius. The wound started small, maybe a scrape from moving limestone blocks for yet another pharaoh's eternal vanity project. But now it's transformed into something that would make modern emergency room doctors reach for their strongest antibiotics while muttering prayers to whatever medical deities they secretly worship. The mainstream historical fact is that infection was the leading cause of death in ancient Egypt, claiming more lives than warfare, famine, or even the occasional crocodile attack. What you're experiencing firsthand is why Egyptian physicians became so desperately innovative in their search for treatments. Your wound, which began as a minor cut 3 days ago, now throbs with a rhythm that matches your increasingly rapid heartbeat. The skin around the injury has turned an alarming shade of red that gradually fades to purple at the edges, creating what looks like a sunset painted by someone having a particularly bad day. The smell is what really gets to you, though. It's a sweet, nauseating odor that somehow manages to be both cloying and putrid simultaneously. The scent of tissue breaking down as bacteria party like it's the end of the world. Which, from your perspective, it very well might be. You've seen this progression before in other workers, and you know the statistics aren't encouraging. Without effective treatment, roughly 60% of serious wound infections in ancient Egypt proved fatal, turning minor accidents into death sentences with depressing regularity. The pain comes in waves now, each surge bringing a fever spike that makes you feel alternately like you're freezing in the desert heat or melting from the inside out. Your body's immune system is waging a war it's probably going to lose, sending white blood cells to battle an invasion that's already established beachheads throughout your circulatory system. The quirky detail that most people don't realize is that ancient Egyptians could actually observe many stages of infection with remarkable accuracy, developing detailed classifications for different types of wound deterioration that rival modern medical terminology in their precision. This is where moldy bread enters your personal medical drama like an unlikely superhero arriving just as the villain's monologue reaches its climactic peak. The temple physician who examines your wound has seen this progression countless times, and he knows that conventional treatments, honey, animal fat, various herbal concoctions, might slow the infection but probably won't stop it. What you need is something that can actually kill the bacteria causing the problem, not just make the symptoms more bearable, while you slowly deteriorate into a cautionary tale about workplace safety. The physician explains the situation with the bedside manner of someone who's delivered this news too many times to sugarcoat it effectively. Your wound has progressed beyond the stage where surface treatments prove effective. The infection has likely entered your bloodstream, meaning your entire body is now the battlefield rather than just the original injury site. In modern terms, you're developing sepsis, though the ancient Egyptians describe it as fire in the blood, or poison spreading through the sacred vessels, which is actually a pretty accurate metaphor considering the circumstances. Historians still argue whether Egyptian physicians truly understood the mechanism by which moldy bread worked, or whether they simply observed its effectiveness and incorporated it into treatment protocols through empirical trial and error. What's certain is that they recognized moldy bread's unique ability to halt infections that resisted other therapies, even if they attributed this power to divine intervention rather than antibiotic properties. The preparation of your moldy bread treatment becomes a carefully orchestrated medical ritual. The physician first cleans your wound with beer, not because ancient Egyptians were particularly devoted to happy hour, but because they discovered that alcoholic beverages had antiseptic properties that helped prepare infected tissue for more aggressive treatment. The cleaning process is about as pleasant as you'd expect, involving the removal of dead tissue and debris while you do your best not to scream loudly enough to wake the pharaoh's mummy down the hall. The moldy bread itself looks exactly like what you'd expect from bread that's been deliberately allowed to rot. Blue-green patches cover the surface like biological graffiti, while white, cottony growth creates texture that resembles miniature sheep grazing on a very small, very disgusting hillside. The smell is surprisingly mild, earthy and slightly sweet, nothing like the aggressive odor emanating from your infected wound. The physician explains that different colored molds provide different therapeutic benefits, though he frames this in terms of divine blessing rather than biochemical activity. The application process requires careful timing and technique. The physician first creates a poultice by mixing the moldy portions of bread with honey and beer, creating a paste that's probably the least appetizing substance ever deliberately applied to human flesh. This mixture gets packed directly into your wound, which produces a sensation that's difficult to describe but falls somewhere between relief and exquisite torture. The honey serves multiple purposes, providing antiseptic properties, creating an environment that prevents harmful bacteria from interfering with the beneficial mold activity, and probably making the whole experience slightly less traumatic by adding familiar sweetness to an otherwise disturbing procedure. The immediate aftermath is where moldy bread medicine either proves its worth or fails spectacularly, with very little middle ground for disappointed but manageable outcomes. Within hours, you begin experiencing changes that would fascinate modern infectious disease specialists. Your fever starts breaking in irregular waves, your wound drainage shifts from the thick, malodorous pus of bacterial infection to clearer fluid that suggests healing rather than deterioration, and most remarkably, the angry red inflammation around the injury begins receding like a tide flowing backward. What you're experiencing is essentially primitive antibiotic therapy, though neither you nor your physician understands the specific mechanisms involved. The molds growing on Egyptian bread, primarily Penicillium species, the same genus that would eventually give the world penicillin, produce natural compounds that interfere with bacterial cell wall formation, effectively causing invading microorganisms to self-destruct at the cellular level. Your immune system, no longer overwhelmed by exponentially multiplying bacteria, can finally gain the upper hand in what had been a losing battle. The psychological impact of successful moldy bread treatment is almost as important as the physical healing. After days of increasing pain and the growing certainty that you're probably going to die from something as mundane as a work-related scrape, the rapid improvement creates almost euphoric relief. This emotional response actually contributes to healing by reducing stress hormones that can interfere with immune function, creating a positive feedback loop that accelerates recovery beyond what purely biochemical intervention might achieve. Within a week, your wound has transformed from a potentially fatal infection into what looks like a normal healing injury. The tissue that had been dying and sloughing away begins regenerating, new skin grows across the damaged area, and the systemic symptoms of blood poisoning fade into memory. You've experienced something that won't be formally understood by medical science for another 3,000 years, but which ancient Egyptian physicians had already incorporated into standard treatment protocols through careful observation and systematic application. The broader implications of your successful treatment extend far beyond personal survival. Every moldy bread success story reinforces Egyptian confidence in their innovative medical approaches, encouraging further experimentation and refinement of fungal therapies. Your recovery becomes part of a growing body of evidence that establishes moldy bread as legitimate medicine rather than desperate last resort, contributing to its eventual integration into mainstream Egyptian medical practice and its spread throughout the ancient world. You're hunched over a papyrus scroll that's older than most civilizations, squinting at hieroglyphic medical prescriptions that read like a bizarre fusion of scientific journal and spellbook. The Edwin Smith papyrus lies before you, its reed paper surface covered with the oldest known surgical treatise in human history, while nearby sits the Ebers papyrus, a medical encyclopedia that makes modern pharmaceutical references look like children's picture books in terms of sheer comprehensive ambition. The mainstream historical fact is that these papyri represent the pinnacle of ancient medical documentation, containing over 700 medical formulas and the world's first recorded clinical observations. What makes them extraordinary isn't just their age, dating to around 1600 BC but copying much older texts, but their systematic approach to recording both successful and failed treatments, including detailed protocols for moldy bread applications that read with surprising scientific rigor. The Edwin Smith papyrus fascinates you because it approaches medicine with an almost modern rationality that seems completely out of place in an era when most people believed illness resulted from angry gods or insufficient pyramid construction. Case 28 describes a gaping wound in a patient's throat, detailing symptoms with clinical precision that would make contemporary emergency room physicians nod approvingly. The treatment protocol combines surgical intervention with moldy bread applications, noting specific timing requirements and expected healing progressions with an attention to detail that suggests these weren't theoretical prescriptions but battle-tested procedures refined through countless real-world applications. But then, just as you're admiring this ancient scientific approach, Case 29 transitions seamlessly from clinical observation into magical incantation, instructing physicians to recite spells while applying moldy bread poultices. The cognitive dissonance is jarring. One moment you're reading what could pass for modern medical documentation, the next you're encountering instructions to speak these words over the moldy bread. I am the protection of this patient. I drive away the enemy that is in this wound. It's like finding a perfectly rational technical manual that occasionally breaks into Broadway musical numbers. The Ebers papyrus takes this integration of rational medicine and magical thinking even further, presenting moldy bread prescriptions alongside treatments involving crocodile dung, honey, and various combinations that would make modern pharmacists question their career choices. Recipe 821 specifies moldy bread, fresh bread crumbs, honey of the beekeeper, fat of the ox, and beer. Mixed together, apply to the wound for 4 days. The instructions continue with precise measurements and application techniques, then conclude with a spell invoking Isis and Horus to bless the treatment, because apparently ancient physicians believed in both proper dosage and divine endorsement. The quirky detail that most medical historians miss is how these papyri reveal Egyptian physicians conducting what amount to primitive clinical trials. Multiple versions of similar prescriptions appear throughout both documents, with subtle variations in ingredients, proportions, and application methods. Careful analysis suggests physicians were systematically testing different formulations and recording results, gradually refining their moldy bread protocols through empirical observation rather than just following tradition blindly. You notice that the papyri distinguish between different types of mold with terminology that suggests sophisticated understanding of fungal varieties. Green bread mold receives different applications than white bread mold, and both are treated as distinct from black bread corruption, which is specifically contraindicated for wound treatment. This level of discrimination implies that Egyptian physicians could reliably identify beneficial versus harmful mold species, developing quality control standards that prevented dangerous contamination while ensuring therapeutic effectiveness. The documentation also reveals how moldy bread medicine evolved from desperate experimental treatment to established medical practice. Early prescriptions appear tentative, often listed as alternatives when conventional treatments fail. Later entries present moldy bread as first-line therapy for specific conditions, with confident dosage recommendations and detailed protocols that assume physician familiarity with the technique. This progression, tracked across different sections of the papyri, provides a fascinating glimpse into how medical innovation becomes accepted practice in ancient civilizations. Historians still argue whether the magical elements in these prescriptions represent genuine religious belief or professional insurance policies, physicians covering their bases by invoking divine protection alongside practical treatment. What's undeniable is that the combination proved remarkably effective, creating a medical system that integrated empirical observation with spiritual framework in ways that enhanced rather than hindered therapeutic outcomes. The prescriptions themselves read like ancient chemistry experiments disguised as religious rituals. One particularly detailed entry specifies that moldy bread should be prepared during the third day after new moon, mixed with honey, in proportions equal to a man's thumb, and applied while reciting specific incantations. 7 times 7 times. Modern analysis suggests the lunar timing might actually optimize mold growth cycles, the honey proportions create ideal antiseptic conditions, and the repetitive incantations serve as timing mechanisms ensuring adequate treatment duration. You discover that different papyri contain variations of the same basic prescriptions, suggesting widespread knowledge sharing among Egyptian medical practitioners. A moldy bread treatment documented in Memphis appears with slight modifications in Thebes, while Alexandrian physicians developed their own refinements of basic protocols. This geographic distribution indicates that moldy bread medicine wasn't confined to specific regions or medical schools but represented broadly accepted therapeutic practice throughout Egyptian civilization. The papyri also document treatment failures with refreshing honesty, recording cases where moldy bread applications proved ineffective or caused adverse reactions. These negative results are presented without shame or defensive explanations, suggesting that Egyptian physicians understood medical treatment as probabilistic rather than guaranteed. Failed cases include detailed descriptions of symptoms that didn't improve, unexpected complications that developed during treatment, and patient factors that seemed to influence therapeutic outcomes. Perhaps most remarkably, you find evidence that ancient physicians were beginning to understand dosage relationships and treatment timing that wouldn't be formally established until modern pharmaceutical development. Prescriptions specify not just what to apply, but how much, how often, and for how long. Some entries even include instructions for adjusting treatment based on patient response, increasing moldy bread applications if initial improvement stalls, or reducing frequency if healing progresses more rapidly than expected. The integration of surgical and pharmaceutical approaches in these ancient texts would be impressive in any era. Physicians are instructed to clean wounds surgically, removing dead tissue and foreign material, before applying moldy bread treatments. Post-surgical care protocols include monitoring for specific signs of infection, adjusting mold applications based on wound drainage characteristics, and transitioning to maintenance therapy as healing progresses. This comprehensive approach combines multiple therapeutic modalities in ways that maximize treatment effectiveness while minimizing complications. The economic aspects of moldy bread medicine also appear in papyrus documentation, with detailed records of ingredient costs, preparation time requirements, and fee structures for different types of treatment. Wealthy patients received more elaborate preparations involving rare molds cultivated under controlled conditions, while standard treatments used commonly available bread molds mixed with basic ingredients. This tiered approach ensured that effective therapy remained accessible across different social classes while allowing physicians to profit from premium services for affluent clientele. By the time you finish examining these ancient medical texts, you realize you've been reading humanity's first systematic documentation of antibiotic therapy, recorded 3 millennia before modern science understood the mechanisms involved. These papyri represent not just historical curiosities but functional medical manuals that guided successful treatment of infectious disease using principles that remain valid today. The combination of careful observation, systematic experimentation, and detailed documentation created a medical tradition that saved countless lives while laying groundwork for future pharmaceutical development that would eventually revolutionize global healthcare. You're standing in the sacred preparation chamber of a temple medical center, watching Egyptian physicians transform moldy bread medicine from accidental discovery into refined pharmaceutical art. The air is thick with incense and the earthy smell of controlled decay, while priests and healers move through cultivation rituals that would make modern laboratory technicians weep with envy at their attention to sterile technique and quality control. The head physician, his hands stained with the telltale blue-green of therapeutic mold, demonstrates the intricate process that transforms ordinary bread into life-saving medicine. The mainstream historical fact is that Egyptian temple complexes served as both religious centers and medical schools, where physician priests developed standardized procedures for preparing and applying various treatments. What you're witnessing goes far beyond simple bread spoilage into something approaching ancient biotechnology, complete with environmental controls and quality assurance protocols that rival modern pharmaceutical manufacturing in their systematic precision. The cultivation process begins with bread selection that follows criteria more rigorous than most people apply to choosing wine. Only loaves made from specific wheat varieties, ground to particular fineness, and baked according to exact specifications qualify for medical transformation. The bread must be either too fresh nor too stale. Fresh loaves resist mold development, while overly aged bread attracts harmful bacteria that contaminate therapeutic cultures. The sweet spot, discovered through generations of trial and error, occurs approximately 18 to 24 hours after baking, when the bread's moisture content and surface pH create optimal conditions for beneficial mold growth. The environmental controls would impress modern microbiologists with their sophistication. Temple cultivation chambers maintain specific temperature and humidity levels through ingenious architectural features, underground chambers that stay naturally cool, ventilation systems that regulate airflow without creating drafts that might disturb developing cultures, and water basins that maintain consistent atmospheric moisture. The quirky detail that most people miss is how Egyptian architects designed these spaces with acoustic properties that supposedly enhance mold growth through harmonic vibrations, though modern science suggests this was probably coincidental rather than causally effective. The actual inoculation process resembles a religious ceremony crossed with a chemistry experiment. Physician priests begin by selecting starter cultures from previously successful moldy bread batches, carefully transferring beneficial mold spores to fresh loaves using bronze instruments that have been sterilized in flame and blessed with sacred oils. The transfer technique requires delicate touch. Too aggressive and the mold dies from trauma. Too gentle and insufficient spores transfer to establish viable cultures. Master physicians can judge proper inoculation density by subtle color changes and texture variations that take years of experience to recognize reliably. Different mold varieties receive distinct cultivation protocols, reflecting Egyptian understanding that various fungal species provide different therapeutic benefits. Blue-green molds get developed in cooler, more humid conditions and are reserved for serious wound infections and blood poisoning. White, cottony cultures are cultivated in warmer, drier environments and used primarily for surface injuries and skin conditions. The most prized therapeutic molds, rare strains that produce distinctive antibiotic compounds, require special cultivation techniques involving specific combinations of temperature, humidity, and timing that were closely guarded professional secrets passed down through medical dynasties. The timing of mold cultivation follows complex calculations that integrate lunar cycles, seasonal changes, and astrological considerations with practical factors like temperature and humidity variations. While modern science would dismiss the astronomical elements as superstition, careful analysis suggests that lunar timing might actually correlate with optimal atmospheric conditions for mold growth, while seasonal considerations ensure consistent environmental parameters that enhance cultivation success rates. Quality control during the cultivation process involves daily inspection protocols that would satisfy modern pharmaceutical regulators. Physician priests examine developing cultures for color consistency, texture uniformity, and the absence of contaminating bacteria or harmful fungi. Cultures that show signs of corruption, wrong colors, offensive odors, or unusual growth patterns are immediately discarded and their cultivation vessels sterilized before reuse. This systematic approach prevents dangerous contamination while ensuring that only therapeutically effective mold reaches patients. Historians still argue whether Egyptian mold cultivation techniques represent genuine scientific methodology or elaborate religious ritual that accidentally achieved therapeutic effectiveness. What's undeniable is that the systematic approach produced consistent results that saved lives and established moldy bread as reliable medicine rather than desperate experimental treatment. The preparation of therapeutic applications requires equal precision in combining mold cultures with carrier substances that enhance effectiveness while preventing adverse reactions. Honey serves as the primary mixing medium, providing antiseptic properties that prevent bacterial contamination while creating a consistency suitable for wound application. The honey-to-mold ratio follows specific proportions that optimize therapeutic potency without causing tissue irritation. Too little honey and the mixture becomes caustic. Too much and the mold activity gets diluted beyond therapeutic effectiveness. Additional ingredients get incorporated based on specific treatment requirements and patient conditions. Beer provides antiseptic properties while making the mixture more pleasant to apply. Animal fats create protective barriers that prevent premature drying, and various plant extracts add complementary therapeutic effects that enhance mold activity. The final preparations resemble primitive antibiotic ointments that remain stable for several days while maintaining therapeutic potency. The application techniques involve careful wound preparation that maximizes treatment effectiveness while minimizing patient discomfort. Wounds receive thorough cleaning with beer or honey solutions to remove debris and surface bacteria that might interfere with mold activity. Dead tissue gets debrided using bronze instruments, creating clean wound surfaces that promote healing while eliminating potential sources of continued infection. The moldy bread preparation is then applied in layers, with clean linen bandages securing the treatment, while allowing air circulation that prevents anaerobic bacterial growth. Post-application monitoring follows systematic protocols that track healing progress while watching for signs of treatment failure or adverse reactions. Physician priests examine wounds daily, documenting changes in drainage, inflammation, and patient symptoms using terminology that enables accurate communication between different healers treating similar conditions. Successful treatments show predictable improvement patterns, while failures require immediate intervention to prevent life-threatening complications. The training of new physician priests in moldy bread cultivation techniques follows formal apprenticeship programs that combine practical instruction with theoretical knowledge. Students spend years learning to identify different mold species, master cultivation timing, and develop the subtle skills required for successful therapeutic applications. The most talented apprentices eventually become master cultivators capable of producing the rare, highly effective mold strains that represent the pinnacle of ancient Egyptian pharmaceutical achievement. The economic organization of temple mold production creates sustainable systems that ensure consistent availability of therapeutic cultures while funding continued research and development. Wealthy patients pay premium prices for treatments using the finest mold cultures, while basic preparations remain accessible to ordinary citizens. This tiered pricing structure provides economic incentives for continued innovation while maintaining the social benefits that establish moldy bread medicine as accepted medical practice rather than exclusive luxury treatment. By evening, as you observe the final preparation rituals, you realize you've witnessed humanity's first systematic pharmaceutical manufacturing operation. The combination of careful environmental control, quality assurance protocols, and standardized preparation techniques created reliable medicine that saved countless lives while establishing principles of drug development that remain valid today. These ancient temple workshops represent not just historical curiosities but functional pharmaceutical laboratories that produced effective treatments using principles that modern science has validated and refined rather than replaced. You're navigating the complex social hierarchy of ancient Egyptian medicine, where your access to moldy bread treatment depends less on medical need and more on your position in a society more stratified than a geological textbook. The pharaoh's golden sarcophagus gleams in the distance while you observe how the same therapeutic mold gets packaged, priced, and presented differently depending on whether you're divine royalty, priestly aristocracy, skilled craftsman, or someone whose primary qualification is the ability to lift heavy stones without complaining too loudly. The mainstream historical fact is that ancient Egyptian society operated on rigid class distinctions that affected every aspect of daily life, including medical care. What makes the moldy bread story fascinating is how this revolutionary treatment both reinforced and occasionally challenged traditional social boundaries, creating medical hierarchies that reflected broader cultural values while sometimes transcending them when life and death situations demanded practical solutions over protocol adherence. At the pinnacle of Egyptian medical privilege sits the pharaoh, whose access to moldy bread treatment resembles what modern billionaires might receive if they could afford personalized pharmaceutical companies. Royal physicians maintain exclusive mold cultivation facilities within palace complexes, developing therapeutic cultures using the finest ingredients available throughout the empire. The pharaoh's moldy bread gets prepared with honey harvested from sacred temple apiaries, mixed with oils imported from Nubia, and applied using instruments crafted from precious metals that probably cost more than most people's annual income. The royal treatment protocols involve elaborate ceremonies that transform medical procedure into religious spectacle. Teams of physician priests coordinate the preparation of therapeutic molds while court astronomers calculate optimal timing based on celestial alignments that supposedly enhance healing effectiveness. The pharaoh's wounds receive moldy bread applications that incorporate rare fungal strains cultivated specifically for royal use, combined with exotic ingredients that demonstrate divine favor while presumably providing superior therapeutic benefits. The quirky detail that often gets overlooked is how royal medical records suggest pharaohs actually received less effective treatment than middle-class patients in some cases. The elaborate preparations and exotic additives sometimes interfered with basic mold activity, while the ceremonial aspects created delays that reduced treatment effectiveness. Several documented cases show royal patients experiencing complications that might have been avoided with simpler, more direct applications of basic moldy bread preparations, proving that sometimes more expensive doesn't necessarily mean better, even in ancient Egypt. Priestly classes occupy the next tier of medical privilege, receiving moldy bread treatments that balance religious significance with therapeutic effectiveness. Temple physicians, who often double as patients when treating each other, develop refined preparation techniques that optimize mold potency while maintaining spiritual appropriateness. Their treatments involve high-quality ingredients and careful cultivation procedures, but without the excessive ceremonial elements that sometimes compromise royal medical care. The priest-physicians create interesting dynamics within medical hierarchies because they simultaneously provide and receive treatment, leading to innovations driven by personal stakes and therapeutic effectiveness. When treating fellow priests, they can't rely on placebo effects or ceremonial distraction to mask treatment failures. The medicine either works or it doesn't, and professional reputations depend on consistent results. This accountability creates pressures for genuine therapeutic advancement rather than merely impressive-looking procedures. Skilled craftsmen and artisans, the people who actually build the monuments and create the artifacts that make pharaohs famous, occupy a middle tier of medical access that reflects their economic importance despite their lower social status. These workers receive moldy bread treatments that emphasize practical effectiveness over ceremonial presentation, often resulting in superior therapeutic outcomes compared to more elaborate upper-class preparations. The medical care for skilled workers demonstrates Egyptian understanding that maintaining productive populations requires effective healthcare regardless of social positioning. The treatment protocols for craftsmen involve streamlined preparation techniques that maximize therapeutic benefit while minimizing cost and complexity. Their moldy bread gets prepared using standard ingredients and proven cultivation methods, without exotic additives or elaborate ceremonies that add expense without improving outcomes. This practical approach often produces faster healing and fewer complications than the more elaborate treatments provided to social superiors, creating an interesting inversion where lower status patients sometimes receive superior medical care. Historians still argue whether this medical pragmatism represents genuine Egyptian egalitarianism or simple economic calculation. Keeping productive workers healthy maintains economic stability regardless of social theory. What's clear is that skilled workers had access to effective moldy bread treatment that often surpassed the care available to similar social classes in other ancient civilizations, suggesting that Egyptian medical priorities sometimes transcended strict social hierarchies when practical considerations demanded it. The vast population of agricultural workers, laborers, and servants receives moldy bread treatment that varies dramatically based on local resources and individual circumstances. In regions with abundant grain production and established medical facilities, even low-status patients can access basic moldy bread preparations that provide effective treatment for common infections and injuries. However, in remote areas or during periods of economic hardship, access becomes limited to life-threatening cases where the investment in treatment might preserve valuable labor capacity. The preparation methods for common people involve simplified techniques that maintain therapeutic effectiveness while reducing cost and complexity. Basic moldy bread cultures get mixed with readily available ingredients like common honey and beer, applied using simple procedures that can be taught to family members or local healers without extensive medical training. This democratization of moldy bread medicine creates a foundation of basic healthcare that prevents minor injuries from becoming fatal infections, contributing to population stability that supports broader economic development. Slaves occupy the bottom tier of medical hierarchy, receiving moldy bread treatment only when their survival serves clear economic interests. Valuable slaves with specialized skills might receive treatment comparable to skilled workers, while common laborers get basic care that prevents epidemic diseases from spreading but doesn't extend to individual medical needs. The calculation is purely economic. Treat infections that threaten broader populations or preserve investments in trained personnel, but don't waste resources on easily replaceable labor. The social dynamics of moldy bread medicine create interesting situations where medical effectiveness sometimes overrides social protocol. During epidemics or medical emergencies, physician priests might treat patients regardless of social status, focusing on practical outcomes rather than ceremonial appropriateness. These crisis situations reveal that Egyptian medical knowledge could transcend social barriers when circumstances demanded immediate action over extended protocol. The economic structures supporting moldy bread medicine reflect broader patterns of Egyptian social organization, while creating unique dynamics specific to medical treatment. Wealthy patients subsidize medical research and facility development through their premium payments, enabling innovations that eventually benefit lower social classes through improved standard treatments. This trickle-down effect ensures that medical advances don't remain confined to elite populations but gradually become available throughout society. Regional variations in social medical hierarchies depend on local economic conditions and population demographics. Areas with thriving trade or valuable natural resources can afford better medical care for broader populations, while regions struggling with economic hardship restrict effective treatment to essential personnel. These variations create complex patterns where social status interacts with geographic and economic factors to determine actual access to moldy bread medicine. The training of medical personnel also reflects social hierarchies, with physician priests from elite families receiving comprehensive education in advanced techniques while healers serving common populations learn simplified procedures suitable for basic treatment needs. This educational stratification ensures that different social classes receive medical care appropriate to their status while maintaining overall system efficiency that keeps the entire population reasonably healthy. By nightfall, as you observe the day's final medical consultations across different social levels, you realize that moldy bread medicine both reinforced and challenged traditional Egyptian social structures. While access remained stratified according to class distinctions, the life-saving effectiveness of the treatment created pressures for broader availability that sometimes transcended strict social boundaries. The result was a medical system that reflected social hierarchies while providing basic healthcare access that supported population stability and economic development across all levels of Egyptian society. You're following dusty caravan routes that stretch across the ancient world, where Egyptian merchants are peddling moldy bread like it's the latest miracle cure, which, frankly, it basically is. Your camel snorts disapprovingly at the strange cargo, probably wondering why humans would travel thousands of miles to trade what appears to be spoiled food, while you witness the birth of humanity's first international pharmaceutical trade network that would make modern drug companies weep with envy at its profit margins and market penetration. The mainstream historical fact is that ancient trade routes facilitated the exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies across vast distances, connecting civilizations that might otherwise have remained isolated. What makes the moldy bread trade particularly fascinating is how it represents one of history's first examples of medical technology transfer, where therapeutic knowledge developed in one region gets adapted and implemented across entirely different cultural contexts with varying degrees of success and local modification. The Egyptian merchants you're traveling with carry their precious moldy cultures in specially designed containers that maintain optimal preservation conditions during long desert crossings. These aren't just random spoiled loaves tossed into saddlebags. They're carefully prepared therapeutic preparations packaged in sealed ceramic vessels with climate control systems that would impress modern pharmaceutical logistics specialists. The containers include moisture-regulating materials, temperature-buffering substances, and even primitive shock absorption systems that prevent damage during the inevitable bumpy camel rides across terrain that makes modern roads look like silk carpets. The preservation techniques developed for long-distance moldy bread transport represent genuine technological innovations that extend far beyond simple food storage. Egyptian merchants discovered that certain combinations of honey, wax, and aromatic resins create microenvironments that keep therapeutic molds viable for weeks or even months during extended trade expeditions. These preservation methods maintain mold potency while preventing contamination from harmful bacteria or competing fungi that might develop during transport through varying climatic conditions. The quirky detail that most trade historians miss is how moldy bread commerce creates the ancient world's first cold chain logistics system. Merchants coordinate with oasis settlements to establish way station facilities where therapeutic cultures can be refreshed and replenished during long journeys. These stops function like primitive pharmaceutical distribution centers, complete with quality control procedures and inventory management systems that ensure consistent product availability across vast geographic regions. Your first major trading stop is Mesopotamia, where Babylonian physicians initially greet Egyptian moldy bread medicine with the enthusiasm typically reserved for plague outbreaks or tax collection announcements. The Mesopotamian medical tradition emphasizes elaborate ritual purification and divine intervention, making the practical Egyptian approach to mold therapy seem almost offensively straightforward. However, after witnessing several dramatic recoveries from infections that had resisted local treatments, Babylonian healers begin incorporating moldy bread into their therapeutic arsenal with modifications that reflect local medical philosophy. The Mesopotamian adaptation process creates interesting hybrid treatments that combine Egyptian mold therapy with Babylonian religious practices. Local physicians develop elaborate purification ceremonies that must be performed before applying moldy bread, invoke different deities during treatment procedures, and integrate astronomical timing requirements that reflect Mesopotamian astrological traditions. While these modifications might seem like unnecessary complications, they actually serve important cultural functions that make foreign medical technology acceptable to traditional practitioners and patients. The trade negotiations for moldy bread in Mesopotamian markets reveal fascinating dynamics between therapeutic effectiveness and cultural acceptability. Egyptian merchants must convince local physicians that their spoiled bread really can cure infections that resist conventional treatments, while Mesopotamian healers demand modifications that align with local religious requirements and medical traditions. The resulting compromises create localized versions of moldy bread therapy that maintain therapeutic effectiveness while satisfying cultural expectations. Historians still argue whether the success of moldy bread in Mesopotamian markets represents genuine medical efficacy or successful marketing that exploited exotic appeal to overcome therapeutic skepticism. What's undeniable is that Mesopotamian adoption of Egyptian mold therapy creates the first documented case of successful international medical technology transfer, establishing patterns that would influence pharmaceutical trade throughout ancient history. The caravan route continues northward into Anatolia, where Hittite physicians prove surprisingly receptive to moldy bread medicine, perhaps because their harsh mountain climate creates wound infections that resist conventional herbal treatments. Hittite medical traditions emphasize practical effectiveness over elaborate ceremony, making Egyptian mold therapy easier to integrate without extensive cultural modifications that might compromise therapeutic outcomes. The Hittite adaptation of moldy bread medicine focuses on optimizing cultivation techniques for different climatic conditions than those found in Egypt. Mountain environments require modified preparation methods that account for lower temperatures, varying humidity levels, and different seasonal patterns that affect mold growth cycles. Hittite physicians develop innovative cultivation techniques that actually improve upon original Egyptian methods, creating more potent therapeutic preparations that eventually influence mold therapy development throughout the region. The westward trade routes carry moldy bread medicine into early Greek settlements, where physicians trained in rational observation and systematic inquiry prove ideally suited to understand and improve upon Egyptian techniques. Greek medical practitioners begin documenting treatment outcomes with systematic rigor that surpasses even Egyptian record-keeping, creating detailed case studies that advance understanding of mold therapy effectiveness and optimal application methods. The Greek approach to moldy bread medicine emphasizes experimental modification and systematic testing that transforms imported Egyptian techniques into more refined therapeutic procedures. Greek physicians test different mold varieties, experiment with varying preparation methods, and document treatment outcomes with statistical precision that wouldn't be matched again until modern clinical trials. This systematic approach creates innovations that improve treatment effectiveness while establishing Greek medical centers as advanced training facilities for mold therapy techniques. The southern trade routes extend Egyptian moldy bread commerce into Nubia and sub-Saharan Africa, where different climatic conditions and local medical traditions create unique challenges and opportunities for therapeutic adaptation. The hot, humid environments of southern regions require modified preservation techniques that prevent harmful bacterial contamination while maintaining therapeutic mold viability during transport and storage. Nubian physicians prove particularly innovative in adapting moldy bread medicine to local conditions and medical needs. They develop cultivation techniques optimized for tropical climates, create preservation methods using local materials, and integrate mold therapy with traditional healing practices that enhance rather than compromise therapeutic effectiveness. The Nubian innovations eventually influence Egyptian techniques, creating feedback loops that improve original methods through international exchange. The economic implications of moldy bread trade extend far beyond simple commercial transactions into complex networks of medical knowledge exchange, technological innovation, and cultural adaptation that transform healthcare throughout the ancient world. Egyptian merchants profit not just from selling therapeutic preparations but from licensing cultivation techniques, training foreign physicians, and establishing ongoing consulting relationships that create sustainable revenue streams from medical expertise. The establishment of international moldy bread trade creates standardization pressures that improve quality control and therapeutic consistency across different regions and cultural contexts. Merchants develop grading systems that classify different types of therapeutic molds, establish quality standards that ensure consistent potency, and create certification procedures that guarantee authentic Egyptian techniques versus local imitations that might prove less effective or even dangerous. The competitive dynamics of international moldy bread commerce drive continued innovation as different regions attempt to develop superior products that can capture market share from Egyptian suppliers. This competition leads to improvements in cultivation techniques, preservation methods, and application procedures that benefit patients throughout the ancient world while establishing pharmaceutical innovation as an ongoing process rather than static traditional knowledge. Regional variations in moldy bread preparation create interesting patterns of specialization where different areas become known for particular types of therapeutic applications. Egyptian suppliers maintain advantages in general wound treatment. Mesopotamian practitioners excel at integrating mold therapy with religious healing practices. Greek physicians develop systematic documentation methods, and Nubian innovators create techniques optimized for tropical conditions. By the time your caravan reaches its final destination, you realize you've witnessed the creation of humanity's first international pharmaceutical industry. The trade in moldy bread medicine has established patterns of medical technology transfer, quality standardization, and competitive innovation that would influence healthcare development for millennia. What began as an accidental Egyptian discovery has become a global therapeutic network that saves lives across multiple civilizations while creating economic opportunities that fund continued medical advancement throughout the ancient world. You're witnessing a bizarre ancient medical Olympics where civilizations compete to develop the most outrageous treatments for diseases that would make modern doctors reach for their strongest antibiotics while muttering prayers to whatever pharmaceutical deities they secretly worship. While Egyptians are revolutionizing healthcare with moldy bread, their neighbors are experimenting with therapeutic approaches that range from genuinely innovative to spectacularly misguided, creating a fascinating panorama of ancient medical creativity that proves human ingenuity knows no bounds when faced with life-threatening infections. The mainstream historical fact is that ancient civilizations developed diverse medical traditions based on local resources, cultural beliefs, and accumulated experience with different therapeutic approaches. What makes this period particularly interesting is how Egyptian moldy bread medicine provides a baseline of effectiveness against which you can measure the relative success and spectacular failures of competing ancient medical systems that were simultaneously developing their own approaches to infection treatment. In Mesopotamia, while some physicians are adopting Egyptian moldy bread techniques, traditionalists are doubling down on treatments that would make modern emergency room staff question their career choices. Babylonian healers swear by therapeutic applications involving fresh urine mixed with crushed beetles, applied while reciting elaborate incantations that supposedly invoke divine healing power. The theory involves purification through bodily fluids combined with insect-derived compounds that might contain beneficial properties, though the practice usually produces infections worse than the original problems. The Mesopotamian approach to wound treatment also includes applications of heated animal dung mixed with fermented grain, creating poultices that smell exactly as terrible as you'd expect while providing bacterial cultures that would fascinate modern microbiologists, for all the wrong reasons. The logic involves introducing life force through decomposing organic matter, which occasionally works through pure coincidence when beneficial bacteria happen to outcompete harmful strains, but more often creates complications that require increasingly desperate interventions. The quirky detail that most medical historians overlook is how Mesopotamian physicians develop elaborate diagnostic techniques based on examining sheep livers and bird flight patterns, believing these observations reveal divine intentions regarding patient outcomes. While these methods obviously have no therapeutic value, they create psychological frameworks that sometimes enhance healing through placebo effects and stress reduction, proving that even completely irrational medical practices can occasionally produce beneficial results through indirect mechanisms. Greek medical traditions, emerging during this same period, take a more systematic approach that combines rational observation with theoretical frameworks that would influence Western medicine for centuries to come. However, their treatments often involve combinations that seem logical in theory but prove problematic in practice. Greek physicians favor bloodletting techniques that supposedly balance bodily humors, often removing so much blood that patients die from treatment rather than disease, creating cure rates that would make Egyptian moldy bread specialists look like miracle workers by comparison. The Greek approach to infection treatment includes applications of wine mixed with various herbs and metals, creating antiseptic solutions that occasionally prove effective but more often cause chemical burns that compound existing problems. Their theoretical framework emphasizes balancing hot, cold, wet, and dry elements within the body, leading to treatments that focus on achieving philosophical balance rather than eliminating infectious organisms that cause actual medical problems. The competitive aspect between Greek and Egyptian medicine creates interesting dynamics where practitioners from both traditions attempt to demonstrate superior therapeutic effectiveness through public demonstrations that resemble ancient medical cage matches. Greek physicians challenge Egyptian healers to treat identical patients using their respective methods, creating informal clinical trials that provide fascinating insights into comparative treatment outcomes during an era that predates formal scientific methodology by several centuries. Historians still argue whether these medical competitions represent genuine scientific inquiry or elaborate professional marketing designed to establish medical reputations and attract wealthy patients. What's clear is that these comparative demonstrations often favor Egyptian moldy bread treatments over Greek bloodletting and humor balancing approaches, contributing to the gradual adoption of mold therapy throughout Mediterranean medical communities. Persian medical traditions contribute their own unique approaches to infection treatment, emphasizing fire-based purification techniques that involve burning various substances near or on infected wounds. Persian healers believe that flames can drive out evil spirits causing illness while purifying corrupted flesh, leading to treatments that combine controlled burning with herbal applications that create therapeutic smoke. While these techniques occasionally succeed through antiseptic effects of smoke and heat, they more often cause severe burns that create worse problems than original infections. The Persian fire purification approach includes elaborate ceremonies where patients are surrounded by burning aromatic woods and resins while physicians recite prayers and perform ritual dances. These treatments create impressive theatrical effects that enhance psychological healing while providing minimal actual therapeutic benefit, though the aromatic compounds sometimes have mild antiseptic properties that contribute to occasional treatment successes. Celtic and Germanic tribes developed their own distinctive approaches to infection treatment that emphasize herbal combinations mixed with animal products in ways that would challenge modern pharmaceutical chemists to explain their theoretical basis. Celtic healers create poultices involving crushed mistletoe, fermented mare's milk, and ground oak bark, applied during specific lunar phases while singing traditional healing songs that supposedly enhance therapeutic effectiveness through harmonic vibration. The Germanic approach to wound treatment involves applications of heated honey mixed with crushed insects and tree sap, creating antiseptic combinations that occasionally prove effective through honey's natural antibacterial properties, though the insect additions usually introduce contamination that negates any beneficial effects. Their treatments also include elaborate ritual scarification that supposedly draws infections out through the skin, creating additional wounds that provide new opportunities for bacterial invasion. Indian medical traditions, developing sophisticated theoretical frameworks during this period, emphasize balance between different life forces through treatments that combine herbal preparations with dietary modifications and breathing techniques. While their holistic approach shows impressive understanding of psychological factors in healing, their specific treatments for serious infections often prove inadequate for life-threatening conditions that require direct antimicrobial intervention rather than systemic balance adjustment. The Indian approach includes elaborate diagnostic techniques based on pulse examination, urine analysis, and observation of tongue conditions that provide remarkably accurate assessments of patient health status. However, their treatments for acute infections tend to focus on gradual systemic rebalancing rather than immediate antimicrobial action, making them less effective than Egyptian moldy bread therapy for conditions requiring rapid intervention to prevent fatal outcomes. Chinese medical traditions, simultaneously developing during this period, create comprehensive theoretical systems that integrate herbal medicine with acupuncture and dietary therapy in ways that address infection through multiple therapeutic modalities. While their systematic approach shows impressive sophistication, their treatments for serious wound infections often prove insufficient for conditions that require powerful antimicrobial intervention rather than gradual energy rebalancing. The Chinese emphasis on preventing illness rather than treating acute conditions creates medical systems optimized for maintaining health in healthy populations rather than rescuing patients from life-threatening infections. This preventive focus produces impressive results for chronic conditions and general wellness but proves less effective than Egyptian mold therapy when dealing with acute bacterial infections that require immediate, powerful antimicrobial treatment. The comparative effectiveness of these different medical traditions becomes apparent through informal networks of traveling healers, merchants, and diplomats who observed treatment outcomes across different civilizations. Egyptian moldy bread medicine consistently demonstrates superior results for serious infections, leading to gradual adoption of mold therapy techniques throughout regions initially committed to alternative medical approaches. The cross-cultural medical exchanges create fascinating hybrid treatments that combine Egyptian mold therapy with local medical traditions, producing innovations that sometimes improve upon original Egyptian techniques while maintaining cultural acceptability for traditional practitioners. These synthesis approaches demonstrate how medical knowledge can transcend cultural boundaries when therapeutic effectiveness provides clear advantages over existing treatments. By evening, as you observe healers from different traditions treating similar conditions, you realize that Egyptian moldy bread medicine represents a genuine breakthrough in therapeutic effectiveness that stands out dramatically against contemporary alternatives. While other civilizations develop elaborate theoretical frameworks and impressive ceremonial procedures, the Egyptians accidentally discover actual antimicrobial therapy that saves lives through direct biological action rather than psychological placebo effects or philosophical balance adjustments. This comparison highlights how sometimes the most important medical advances emerge from practical observation rather than theoretical sophistication. You're standing in what might be history's most accidental laboratory, watching Egyptian physicians stumble toward discoveries that won't be formally understood by science for another 3 millennia. The irony is delicious. While modern researchers would spend decades designing controlled experiments to test antibiotic properties, these ancient healers are accidentally conducting the world's first clinical trials simply by trying to keep people from dying of infected paper cuts and workplace accidents that would barely warrant a band-aid in contemporary emergency rooms. The mainstream historical fact is that many crucial scientific discoveries result from accidental observations rather than systematic research, and Egyptian moldy bread medicine represents perhaps the most significant example of serendipitous medical breakthrough in ancient history. What you're witnessing goes beyond simple luck into systematic accident. Egyptian physicians are accidentally following scientific methodology while believing they're practicing religious medicine, creating experimental conditions that produce reproducible results without understanding the underlying mechanisms. The accidental scientific method begins with Egyptian physicians' obsessive record-keeping, driven by religious requirements to document divine interventions for temple archives. Every moldy bread treatment gets recorded with patient details, symptoms, preparation methods, and outcomes, creating what amounts to clinical trial documentation disguised as religious chronicle. The priests believe they're recording divine miracles, but they're actually compiling systematic evidence of antibiotic effectiveness that would satisfy modern pharmaceutical regulators. The experimental conditions emerge naturally from Egyptian medical practice rather than deliberate scientific design. Different temples use varying mold cultivation techniques based on local resources and traditional preferences, creating natural control groups that test different preparation methods. Patients with similar conditions receive treatments prepared using different techniques, while careful documentation enables comparison of outcomes across different approaches, essentially conducting randomized controlled trials without realizing it. The quirky detail that most science historians miss is how Egyptian physicians accidentally discover dosage relationships and treatment timing through trial and error experimentation disguised as religious optimization. Attempts to determine the most spiritually appropriate amounts of moldy bread application lead to systematic testing of different dosages, while efforts to identify divinely favored timing result in experiments with treatment frequency and duration that establish optimal therapeutic protocols. The quality control accidents that lead to major breakthroughs often involve contamination events that initially appear to represent treatment failures but actually reveal important principles of antibiotic activity. When harmful bacteria contaminate mold cultures, Egyptian physicians observe that certain types of contamination completely eliminate therapeutic effectiveness, while others enhance it. These observations lead to systematic efforts to control bacterial contamination that accidentally establish sterile technique principles centuries before germ theory. The environmental control discoveries emerge from attempts to create optimal spiritual conditions for divine healing rather than scientific understanding of microbial growth requirements. Egyptian physicians experiment with different temperatures, humidity levels, and atmospheric conditions in their mold cultivation chambers, believing they're optimizing divine intervention but actually discovering optimal growing conditions for antibiotic-producing fungi. The comparative effectiveness observations result from Egyptian physicians treating patients with identical conditions using different mold preparations, initially attempting to determine which techniques receive greater divine favor but accidentally conducting systematic efficacy comparisons. These natural experiments reveal that certain mold species produce superior therapeutic results, leading to selective cultivation of the most effective strains without understanding why they work better. Historians still argue whether Egyptian physicians possessed intuitive understanding of scientific principles or simply stumbled onto effective treatments through systematic religious practice that accidentally mimicked scientific methodology. What's undeniable is that their accidental experiments produced genuine scientific discoveries that wouldn't be formally understood until Alexander Fleming's work with penicillin in the 20th century. The accidental discovery of antibiotic resistance occurs when Egyptian physicians observe that certain infections stop responding to moldy bread treatments that previously proved effective. Initially interpreting this as divine displeasure or spiritual interference, they experiment with different mold preparations and discover that varied antibiotic sources can overcome resistance that develops to specific treatments, accidentally establishing the principle of combination antibiotic therapy. The systematic documentation of side effects and adverse reactions results from religious requirements to record all aspects of divine intervention, including negative outcomes that might indicate spiritual problems requiring additional intervention. This comprehensive record-keeping accidentally creates pharmacovigilance systems that track treatment complications and identify patient factors that influence therapeutic outcomes. The accidental pharmacology discoveries include observations that certain patient characteristics affect moldy bread treatment effectiveness. Egyptian physicians noticed that age, overall health status, wound location, and timing of treatment application all influence therapeutic outcomes, leading to systematic approaches that optimize treatment protocols based on individual patient factors, essentially developing personalized medicine approaches through religious observation. The breakthrough understanding of infection progression emerges from careful documentation of untreated versus treated wound development over time. Egyptian physicians observe that moldy bread intervention at different stages of infection produces dramatically different outcomes, leading to systematic protocols that emphasize early treatment initiation, accidentally discovering the importance of prompt antibiotic therapy for optimal effectiveness. The contamination control discoveries result from efforts to maintain ritual purity in mold preparation rather than scientific understanding of bacterial interference. Egyptian physicians develop elaborate purification procedures that accidentally establish a aseptic technique, preventing harmful bacterial contamination that would compromise therapeutic effectiveness while maintaining beneficial fungal activity. The preservation and storage breakthroughs emerge from practical necessities of maintaining mold cultures over extended periods rather than theoretical understanding of pharmaceutical stability. Egyptian physicians experiment with different preservation methods, accidentally discovering combinations of honey, wax, and other materials that maintain antibiotic potency while preventing degradation that would eliminate therapeutic effectiveness. The dosage optimization accidents occur through attempts to balance spiritual appropriateness with practical effectiveness, leading to systematic testing of different application amounts and frequencies. Egyptian physicians discover that insufficient dosages fail to control infections while excessive applications can cause tissue irritation, accidentally establishing therapeutic windows that optimize treatment benefits while minimizing adverse effects. The treatment duration discoveries result from religious requirements to continue divine intervention until spiritual purification is complete, leading to systematic observation of how long moldy bread applications must continue to achieve permanent infection resolution. These observations accidentally establish optimal treatment courses that prevent relapse while avoiding unnecessary prolonged therapy. The combination therapy innovations emerge from attempts to enhance divine intervention through multiple sacred substances, leading to systematic testing of moldy bread mixed with other therapeutic agents. Egyptian physicians discover that certain combinations enhance antibiotic effectiveness while others interfere with therapeutic activity, accidentally establishing principles of drug interaction that wouldn't be formally understood for millennia. The patient selection insights developed through religious requirements to determine spiritual worthiness for divine healing, leading to systematic documentation of which patient characteristics predict successful treatment outcomes. These observations accidentally identify prognostic factors that influence antibiotic therapy effectiveness, enabling better patient selection and treatment customization. The resistance prevention strategies emerge from efforts to maintain divine favor through varied religious approaches, leading to systematic rotation of different mold preparations and treatment protocols. Egyptian physicians accidentally discover that varying antibiotic exposures prevents the development of resistant infections that might otherwise compromise therapeutic effectiveness. By dawn, as you observe the culmination of these accidental discoveries, you realize you've witnessed humanity's first systematic antibiotic research program, conducted entirely by accident through religious medical practice that accidentally followed scientific methodology. Egyptian physicians have stumbled onto principles of antimicrobial therapy, pharmacology, and clinical research that will remain lost to formal science until the modern era, proving that sometimes the most important discoveries emerge from practical necessity rather than theoretical understanding. You're witnessing the moment when Egyptian moldy bread medicine transforms from isolated local practice into the foundation of medical traditions that will influence healing across cultures and centuries. The ripple effects of this accidental antibiotic discovery spread far beyond the Nile Valley, carried by traders, conquered peoples, and curious physicians who recognize effective medicine when they see it, even if they can't explain why it works. The mainstream historical fact is that Egyptian medical knowledge formed the foundation for Greek, Roman, and Islamic medical traditions, with moldy bread therapy representing one of the most widely adopted Egyptian medical innovations. What you're observing isn't just cultural exchange but medical evolution, as different civilizations adapt Egyptian mold therapy to their own healing philosophies, environmental conditions, and available resources, creating variations that preserve the essential therapeutic principles while reflecting local medical understanding. The Greek medical adoption begins when physicians like Hippocrates encounter Egyptian moldy bread treatments through direct contact with Egyptian medical practitioners in trading centers and diplomatic exchanges. Initially skeptical of what they perceive as primitive folk medicine, Greek physicians gradually recognize the consistent effectiveness of mold therapy for treating infected wounds and incorporate it into their developing medical philosophy, though they interpret its mechanism through their own theories of bodily humors and natural balance. The Greek innovation involves systematic documentation of moldy bread treatments within their emerging medical literature, transforming Egyptian religious medical practice into secular therapeutic knowledge. Greek physicians strip away the religious ritualism surrounding mold preparation while preserving the essential therapeutic techniques, creating standardized protocols that can be taught to students and replicated across different medical centers without requiring religious initiation. The Roman military adoption represents perhaps the most significant expansion of Egyptian mold therapy, as Roman physicians recognize its practical value for treating battlefield wounds and incorporate it into standard military medical supplies. Roman legions carry mold cultures across their expanding empire, treating infected wounds from Britain to Mesopotamia using techniques originally developed in Egyptian temples, though Roman physicians focus on practical effectiveness rather than spiritual significance. The Roman innovation involves large-scale production methods that enable widespread distribution of moldy bread medicine throughout their territories. Roman medical administrators developed systematic approaches to mold cultivation, preservation, and transport that maintain therapeutic effectiveness across vast distances and varied climates, essentially creating the ancient world's first pharmaceutical distribution network based on Egyptian antibiotic principles. The quirky detail that medical historians often overlook is how Roman bathhouses accidentally become centers for mold therapy experimentation, as the warm, humid conditions ideal for bathing also provide perfect environments for cultivating therapeutic fungi. Roman physicians discover that mold cultures grown in bathhouse environments often demonstrate enhanced therapeutic properties, leading to systematic efforts to optimize growing conditions that accidentally advance Egyptian mold cultivation techniques. The Islamic medical preservation occurs when Muslim physicians encounter Egyptian and Greco-Roman medical texts during their expansion into former Byzantine territories. Islamic medical scholars like Al-Razi and Ibn Sina, Avicenna, systematically study and preserve ancient mold therapy knowledge, translating Egyptian medical practices into Arabic medical literature while adding their own observations and refinements based on Islamic medical philosophy. The Islamic innovation involves combining Egyptian mold therapy with their own pharmaceutical knowledge, creating compound treatments that enhance therapeutic effectiveness while reducing side effects. Islamic physicians develop sophisticated preparation methods that purify and concentrate active compounds from moldy bread, essentially creating primitive antibiotic preparations that demonstrate enhanced potency compared to original Egyptian techniques. The medieval European rediscovery happens when crusaders returning from the Middle East bring Islamic medical knowledge back to European medical centers, inadvertently reintroducing Egyptian mold therapy to Western medicine after centuries of absence. European physicians initially view these treatments with suspicion, but battlefield effectiveness during the Crusades demonstrates their practical value for treating infected wounds that resist other available therapies. Historians still argue whether the transmission of Egyptian mold therapy knowledge occurred primarily through direct cultural contact or through systematic preservation in medical texts, but evidence suggests both pathways contributed to its widespread adoption across ancient and medieval medical traditions. The Chinese medical integration represents a fascinating example of parallel development, as Chinese physicians independently discover similar mold therapies around the same time period, then encounter Egyptian techniques through Silk Road trade connections. The combination of Chinese and Egyptian mold therapy approaches creates hybrid treatments that demonstrate enhanced effectiveness, proving that the underlying antibiotic principles work regardless of cultural interpretation. The preservation in folk medicine traditions ensures that Egyptian mold therapy survives even when formal medical establishments abandon it during periods of theoretical change. Rural healers across different cultures maintain traditional mold preparation techniques passed down through generations, preserving practical knowledge that formal medicine will later rediscover and validate through scientific analysis. The monastery preservation plays a crucial role in maintaining Egyptian mold therapy knowledge during the Dark Ages, as monastic infirmaries systematically document and practice traditional healing methods including moldy bread treatments. Monastic physicians preserve detailed preparation instructions and therapeutic protocols that enable later Renaissance physicians to rediscover and systematically study these ancient antibiotic techniques. The Renaissance rediscovery occurs when humanist scholars systematically translate and study ancient medical texts, encountering detailed descriptions of Egyptian mold therapy in Greek, Roman, and Islamic medical literature. Renaissance physicians begin systematic experimentation with these ancient techniques, though they interpret their effectiveness through contemporary medical theories rather than understanding the underlying antibiotic mechanisms. The colonial expansion spreads Egyptian-derived mold therapy techniques to new continents as European physicians carry traditional remedies to colonial territories. Native healers in the Americas, Africa, and Asia encounter and adapt these ancient antibiotic techniques, creating new variations that combine Egyptian principles with local medicinal plants and healing philosophies. The academic preservation ensures that knowledge of ancient mold therapy survives in university medical curricula even when practical application declines due to the development of newer treatment methods. Medical schools continue teaching historical examples of effective traditional treatments, preserving theoretical knowledge that will prove valuable when modern researchers begin systematic study of natural antibiotic sources. The pharmaceutical industry connections emerge when modern drug companies begin systematic study of traditional medicines, discovering that many ancient remedies like Egyptian moldy bread therapy contain compounds that demonstrate genuine therapeutic activity. This recognition leads to systematic efforts to identify, isolate, and synthesize active ingredients from traditional treatments, creating modern pharmaceuticals based on ancient healing wisdom. The cultural legacy extends beyond medical applications into broader understanding of how traditional knowledge systems preserve practical wisdom across centuries, even when the underlying scientific principles remain unknown. Egyptian moldy bread therapy demonstrates how systematic observation and careful documentation can produce effective treatments that survive cultural transmission and continue providing therapeutic benefit across dramatically different medical paradigms. As morning breaks over this panorama of medical tradition, you realize you've witnessed how a single accidental discovery in ancient Egypt created ripples that continue influencing modern medicine. The moldy bread that began as religious ritual has become the foundation for antibiotic therapy, proving that sometimes the most important medical breakthroughs emerge from practical necessity rather than theoretical understanding, and that traditional healing wisdom often contains scientific truths waiting to be rediscovered. You're crouching in the dusty shadows of a recently opened tomb, watching archaeologists carefully brush sand from what might be the most medically significant bread loaf in human history. The excitement is palpable as these modern treasure hunters realize they're not just uncovering ancient food storage, they're discovering humanity's first pharmaceutical laboratory, complete with preserved evidence of antibiotic production that predates modern medicine by millennia. The mainstream historical fact is that archaeological discoveries have provided concrete physical evidence of ancient Egyptian medical practices, including preserved samples of moldy bread and sophisticated medical instruments that demonstrate the advanced nature of Egyptian healthcare. What you're witnessing represents the moment when theoretical knowledge from ancient texts becomes tangible reality, as archaeologists uncover actual specimens that prove Egyptian physicians were indeed using primitive antibiotics with remarkable sophistication. The tomb discoveries begin in the Valley of the Kings, where archaeologists exploring lesser-known burial sites stumble upon sealed chambers containing perfectly preserved medical supplies. The dry desert conditions and careful Egyptian preservation techniques have maintained organic materials that would normally decompose within decades, creating a time capsule that preserves actual samples of therapeutic mold preparations alongside the tools used to create and apply them. The bread preservation miracles occur due to the unique combination of Egyptian mummification techniques and desert environmental conditions. Ancient Egyptian embalmers didn't just preserve human bodies, they also preserved medical supplies for the afterlife, treating therapeutic mold preparations with the same careful attention given to more obviously valuable grave goods. The result is moldy bread samples that retain their original structure and, in some cases, still contain identifiable fungal spores after thousands of years of storage. The medical instrument discoveries reveal the sophisticated tools Egyptian physicians used for mold cultivation and application. Archaeologists uncover bronze implements designed specifically for scraping mold from bread surfaces, measuring devices for determining appropriate dosages, and storage containers with tight-fitting lids that maintained optimal conditions for preserving therapeutic preparations. These tools demonstrate that Egyptian mold therapy wasn't crude folk medicine but systematic pharmaceutical practice. The quirky detail that fascinates modern archaeologists is discovering ancient Egyptian medical quality control systems preserved in tomb contents. Some burial chambers contain multiple samples of the same moldy bread preparation, apparently representing different batches tested for therapeutic effectiveness before final selection for burial goods. The careful labeling and organization suggest Egyptian physicians maintain detailed inventory systems for their pharmaceutical supplies. The papyrus preservation provides written documentation that corresponds directly to physical specimens, creating unprecedented opportunities to connect ancient medical theory with actual practice. Archaeologists discover medical scrolls buried alongside moldy bread samples, with detailed preparation instructions that can be compared to the actual preserved specimens to verify the accuracy of ancient medical documentation and understand how theory translated into practical application. The laboratory reconstructions emerge as archaeologists piece together complete medical workshops preserved in temple complexes and palace medical centers. These discoveries reveal sophisticated facilities designed specifically for mold cultivation, including controlled environment chambers, ventilation systems, and water management infrastructure that maintained optimal conditions for growing therapeutic fungi, essentially ancient pharmaceutical manufacturing facilities. The storage system discoveries demonstrate how Egyptian physicians maintained supplies of therapeutic mold preparations over extended periods. Archaeologists uncover elaborate storage facilities with different sections for various stages of mold development, preservation chambers designed to maintain therapeutic potency, and distribution systems that supplied moldy bread medicine to different medical centers throughout Egypt. The patient record connections occur when archaeologists discover mummified remains that show evidence of moldy bread treatment, alongside medical papyri documenting the same patient's care. These discoveries provide direct evidence of treatment outcomes, enabling modern researchers to verify the effectiveness of ancient Egyptian antibiotic therapy through examination of actual healed wounds and infection sites. Historians still argue whether the preserved moldy bread samples represent typical medical supplies or specially prepared materials for elite burials, but the consistency of preservation techniques and the variety of tomb types containing similar materials suggest these specimens reflect standard Egyptian medical practice rather than exceptional cases. The microscopic analysis breakthroughs happen when modern laboratory techniques are applied to ancient specimens, revealing the specific species of mold used in Egyptian medical preparations. Researchers discovered that Egyptian physicians selectively cultivated particular fungal strains that demonstrate genuine antibiotic properties, proving that their therapeutic effectiveness resulted from systematic selection of medically active organisms rather than random experimentation. The DNA preservation miracles occur in some of the best preserved specimens, where modern genetic analysis techniques can identify the exact species of therapeutic molds used by ancient Egyptian physicians. These discoveries enable direct comparison between ancient and modern antibiotic-producing fungi, revealing evolutionary relationships and genetic similarities that explain why Egyptian mold therapy demonstrated consistent therapeutic effectiveness. The chemical analysis revelations emerge when modern analytical chemistry techniques are applied to preserved moldy bread samples, identifying specific antibiotic compounds that remain detectable after millennia of storage. Mass spectrometry and other advanced analytical methods reveal chemical signatures that match known antibiotic substances, providing concrete proof that Egyptian moldy bread contained genuine pharmaceutical compounds. The preservation technique analysis demonstrates how Egyptian physicians developed sophisticated methods for maintaining therapeutic potency in their mold preparations. Modern researchers discovered that ancient preservation methods using honey, wax, and other materials created optimal storage conditions that prevented degradation of active compounds while maintaining fungal viability, essentially ancient pharmaceutical formulation techniques. The manufacturing scale evidence emerges from discoveries of large-scale mold cultivation facilities in temple complexes and palace medical centers. Archaeological evidence reveals systematic production methods that enabled widespread distribution of moldy bread medicine throughout Egyptian territories, proving that this wasn't small-scale folk remedy practice but organized pharmaceutical manufacturing. The quality control discoveries include preserved examples of rejected moldy bread preparations that failed to meet ancient Egyptian therapeutic standards. These specimens demonstrate that Egyptian physicians maintained systematic quality assurance programs, discarding preparations that showed signs of harmful contamination or inadequate therapeutic mold development. The trade network evidence appears in the form of moldy bread medicine discovered in non-Egyptian archaeological sites, proving that Egyptian antibiotic therapy spread throughout the ancient world through systematic trade relationships. These discoveries demonstrate how Egyptian pharmaceutical knowledge influenced medical practices across different cultures and geographical regions. The experimental archaeology projects involve modern researchers attempting to recreate ancient Egyptian mold cultivation techniques using only materials and methods available to ancient physicians. These experiments verify the effectiveness of ancient preparation methods while revealing practical details about daily operations in Egyptian medical facilities that aren't documented in surviving written sources. The tomb context analysis reveals how moldy bread medicine fit into broader Egyptian medical practice and religious beliefs. Archaeological evidence shows these preparations were buried alongside surgical instruments, magical amulets, and religious texts, demonstrating how Egyptian physicians integrated practical antibiotic therapy with spiritual healing approaches in comprehensive medical treatment programs. The preservation comparison studies examine how different storage methods affected the long-term survival of ancient moldy bread specimens. Researchers discovered that Egyptian preservation techniques were remarkably effective at maintaining specimen integrity, with some samples retaining identifiable characteristics that enable detailed analysis thousands of years after their creation. As the sun sets over these remarkable archaeological discoveries, You realize you've witnessed the moment when ancient Egyptian medicine transitions from historical theory to tangible reality. The preserved moldy bread samples and medical instruments provide concrete proof that Egyptian physicians were indeed using sophisticated antibiotic therapy millennia before modern medicine, demonstrating that sometimes the most important medical innovations emerge from practical necessity rather than theoretical understanding, and that careful archaeological investigation can recover medical knowledge that was never completely lost, just temporarily buried. You're standing in Alexander Fleming's laboratory in 1928, watching history's most famous accidental discovery unfold, but with the strange knowledge that this breakthrough moment actually represents humanity rediscovering medical wisdom that Egyptian physicians mastered 3,000 years earlier. The irony is almost overwhelming. While Fleming stares at his contaminated petri dish and realizes that mold can kill bacteria, you know that ancient healers were already applying this principle when the pyramids were still under construction. The mainstream historical fact is that Fleming's discovery of penicillin revolutionized modern medicine and earned him the Nobel Prize. But 20th century researchers gradually realized that various ancient cultures, particularly the Egyptians, had been using primitive antibiotic therapy for millennia before formal scientific understanding emerged. What you're witnessing isn't just scientific discovery but scientific rediscovery, as modern researchers piece together evidence that ancient healing practices contain genuine pharmaceutical wisdom. The Fleming connection begins when early antibiotic researchers start investigating historical medical practices to understand whether other cultures had discovered similar therapeutic principles. Medical historians examining ancient Egyptian texts encounter detailed descriptions of moldy bread therapy that sound remarkably similar to Fleming's penicillin work, leading to systematic investigation of whether ancient physicians had indeed discovered antibiotic principles through empirical observation rather than scientific methodology. The microbiological analysis reveals that some Egyptian moldy bread preparations contained the same Penicillium species that Fleming would later study, proving that ancient physicians were unknowingly using genuine antibiotic-producing organisms. Modern laboratory testing of preserved ancient specimens demonstrates measurable antibiotic activity, confirming that Egyptian mold therapy worked through the same biological mechanisms that Fleming would eventually identify and explain through scientific investigation. The pharmaceutical industry awakening occurs when drug companies realize that traditional medicines might contain undiscovered therapeutic compounds worthy of systematic investigation. Egyptian moldy bread therapy becomes a case study in how ancient healing practices can inform modern pharmaceutical research, leading to systematic programs that investigate traditional remedies for potentially valuable medical applications. The quirky detail that amuses modern medical researchers is how Fleming's famous accidental discovery actually required multiple fortunate coincidences that Egyptian physicians had been systematically creating for centuries. Fleming needed contamination, specific environmental conditions, and careful observation to recognize antibiotic activity, while Egyptian physicians had been deliberately creating these same conditions through religious medical practices that accidentally optimized antibiotic production. The academic rehabilitation begins when medical schools start including historical medicine courses that examine traditional healing practices with scientific rigor rather than dismissing them as primitive superstition. Egyptian moldy bread therapy becomes a standard example of how ancient physicians could achieve effective treatments through systematic observation even without theoretical understanding of underlying mechanisms. The research methodology comparisons reveal fascinating parallels between ancient Egyptian medical documentation and modern clinical trial protocols. Egyptian physicians' careful record-keeping, systematic observation of treatment outcomes, and detailed preparation instructions actually followed many principles of contemporary pharmaceutical research, suggesting that effective medical investigation depends more on systematic methodology than theoretical sophistication. The ethnopharmacology emergence creates systematic academic study of traditional medicines from around the world, with Egyptian antibiotic therapy serving as a foundational example of how indigenous healing practices can contain genuine pharmaceutical wisdom. Modern researchers develop standardized approaches for investigating traditional remedies that might yield new therapeutic compounds or treatment approaches. The World Health Organization recognition occurs when international health agencies acknowledge that traditional medicine systems contain valuable therapeutic knowledge that deserves systematic investigation rather than dismissal. Egyptian moldy bread therapy becomes cited as evidence that traditional healing practices can inform modern medical research and potentially contribute to solving contemporary healthcare challenges. Historians still argue whether ancient physicians like the Egyptians possessed intuitive understanding of scientific principles or simply stumbled onto effective treatments through trial and error experimentation. But modern research demonstrates that regardless of underlying theoretical knowledge, their systematic approaches produced genuinely effective medical interventions. The antibiotic resistance connections emerge when modern researchers realize that ancient physicians' practice of rotating different mold preparations accidentally prevented the development of resistant bacterial strains that plagued contemporary antibiotic therapy. Egyptian medical practices included systematic variation of treatment approaches that modern medicine is rediscovering as essential for maintaining antibiotic effectiveness. The natural product chemistry revolution begins when pharmaceutical researchers start systematically investigating compounds found in traditional medicines, discovering that many ancient remedies contain previously unknown chemical substances with genuine therapeutic properties. Egyptian moldy bread therapy contributes to growing recognition that nature provides a vast pharmaceutical library waiting for systematic investigation. The integrative medicine development creates academic programs that combine traditional healing wisdom with modern scientific methodology, using examples like Egyptian antibiotic therapy to demonstrate how ancient practices can inform contemporary medical research. Medical schools begin teaching courses that examine traditional medicines with scientific rigor while respecting their cultural origins and historical significance. The pharmaceutical archaeology emerges as a new academic discipline that investigates ancient medical practices using modern analytical techniques. Researchers develop standardized approaches for analyzing preserved ancient medicines, reconstructing historical preparation methods, and testing traditional remedies for contemporary therapeutic potential. The biotechnology applications involve modern companies using genetic engineering and other advanced techniques to optimize antibiotic-producing organisms originally identified through traditional medicine research. Egyptian mold therapy contributes to pharmaceutical programs that enhance natural antibiotic production through systematic scientific manipulation of biological systems. The global health implications become apparent when researchers realize that traditional medicine knowledge could help address healthcare challenges in developing regions where expensive modern pharmaceuticals aren't readily available. Egyptian-style mold therapy techniques could potentially provide accessible antibiotic treatments in areas lacking sophisticated medical infrastructure. The medical education reform includes systematic incorporation of medical history and traditional healing practices into contemporary medical curricula. Students learn about Egyptian antibiotic therapy not just as historical curiosity but as example of how systematic observation and careful documentation can produce effective medical interventions regardless of theoretical sophistication. The research funding shifts occur when government agencies and private foundations begin supporting systematic investigation of traditional medicines, recognizing that ancient healing practices might contain solutions to contemporary medical challenges. Egyptian moldy bread therapy becomes cited as justification for increased investment in ethnopharmacological research programs. The patent controversies emerge when pharmaceutical companies attempt to patent compounds derived from traditional medicines, raising ethical questions about whether modern corporations should profit from ancient healing wisdom developed by indigenous cultures. Egyptian antibiotic therapy becomes part of broader debates about intellectual property rights and traditional medical knowledge. The clinical trial designs incorporate lessons learned from ancient medical practices, with researchers recognizing that traditional healing approaches often involve systematic observation and documentation that resembles modern research methodology. Egyptian physicians' treatment protocols inform contemporary clinical trial designs that test traditional remedies using scientific methodology. The public awareness campaigns begin highlighting connections between ancient healing wisdom and modern medical breakthroughs, using examples like Egyptian antibiotic therapy to demonstrate that traditional medicine deserves respect and systematic investigation rather than dismissal as primitive superstition. As you watch Fleming examine his moldy petri dish with growing excitement, You realize you're witnessing not discovery but rediscovery. The moment when modern science finally catches up with ancient medical wisdom that Egyptian physicians had been applying for millennia. The moldy bread that began as religious ritual has come full circle to become the foundation of modern antibiotic therapy, proving that sometimes the most important medical breakthroughs involve recognizing the value of knowledge that was never actually lost, just temporarily forgotten by formal medical education. You're floating in that perfect twilight space where ancient wisdom meets modern understanding, watching the golden threads that connect Egyptian temple healers to contemporary pharmaceutical laboratories, realizing that this story of moldy bread medicine isn't really about bread or mold at all. It's about the timeless human capacity to observe, adapt, and heal, even when we don't fully understand the forces we're working with. The mainstream historical fact is that many of today's most important medical breakthroughs trace their origins to traditional healing practices that preserved therapeutic knowledge across centuries of cultural change and scientific evolution. What you've witnessed throughout this journey demonstrates how genuine medical wisdom transcends theoretical frameworks, surviving not because ancient physicians understood modern pharmacology, but because they developed systematic approaches to healing that worked regardless of underlying explanations. The pharmaceutical connections reveal themselves everywhere once you know how to look. Modern hospitals use antibiotic protocols that echo Egyptian treatment timing. Contemporary wound care incorporates environmental controls that ancient temple physicians discovered through religious practice. Current pharmaceutical manufacturing follows quality control principles that Egyptian healers developed to ensure consistent therapeutic effectiveness in their mold preparations. The natural healing renaissance emerges as modern researchers increasingly recognize that traditional medicine systems contain therapeutic wisdom worth systematic investigation. Egyptian moldy bread therapy becomes a bridge between ancient healing practices and contemporary pharmaceutical research, demonstrating how indigenous medical knowledge can inform modern treatment approaches while respecting cultural origins and historical significance. The personal medicine evolution shows how individual patients increasingly seek healthcare approaches that combine modern scientific understanding with traditional healing wisdom. People discover that the same systematic observation skills that enabled Egyptian physicians to develop effective antibiotic therapy can help contemporary individuals make informed decisions about their own health and wellness approaches. The quirky detail that brings everything full circle is how modern bread-making techniques have accidentally rediscovered some of the same mold cultivation principles that Egyptian physicians used for therapeutic purposes. Artisanal bakers working with traditional fermentation methods sometimes encounter the same beneficial molds that ancient healers systematically cultivated, though contemporary bakers usually discard what Egyptian physicians would have treasured as medicine. The global healing wisdom emerges as researchers recognize that cultures worldwide develop sophisticated medical practices that deserve systematic investigation rather than dismissal. Egyptian antibiotic therapy represents just one example of how traditional healing systems contain therapeutic knowledge that can inform contemporary healthcare approaches while honoring cultural wisdom and historical experience. The environmental healing connections become apparent as modern research reveals how ancient physicians' systematic attention to environmental factors, temperature, humidity, seasonal timing, geographical location, actually reflected sophisticated understanding of how environmental conditions affect both disease development and therapeutic effectiveness. The community medicine lessons show how Egyptian moldy bread therapy succeeded partly because it embedded individual treatment within broader community health approaches. Ancient Egyptian medicine recognized that healing involves social support, environmental management, and community-wide health practices rather than just individual therapeutic interventions. Historians still argue whether the most important lesson from Egyptian moldy bread medicine involves specific therapeutic techniques or broader approaches to systematic healing that combine careful observation, detailed documentation, community support, and willingness to adapt treatment approaches based on individual patient needs and circumstances. The mindful medicine movement incorporates lessons from ancient healing practices like Egyptian mold therapy, emphasizing systematic attention to patient experience, environmental factors, and holistic approaches that address physical symptoms within broader contexts of emotional, social, and spiritual well-being. The sustainable healthcare vision emerges from recognition that traditional medicine systems like ancient Egyptian healing practices often used locally available resources and environmentally sustainable approaches that modern healthcare systems might adapt to address contemporary challenges of cost, accessibility, and environmental impact. The healing relationship wisdom shows how Egyptian physicians' integration of systematic medical treatment with spiritual care and community support created therapeutic relationships that enhance treatment effectiveness through mechanisms that modern medicine is only beginning to understand and systematically incorporate into contemporary healthcare approaches. The resilient medicine principles reveal how traditional healing systems like Egyptian mold therapy survived across centuries of cultural change because they developed adaptable approaches that could maintain therapeutic effectiveness while accommodating different theoretical frameworks, environmental conditions, and cultural contexts. The integrated wellness approaches combine ancient healing wisdom with modern scientific understanding to create comprehensive healthcare systems that address physical symptoms while supporting overall well-being through attention to nutrition, environmental factors, social relationships, and personal meaning-making that affects health outcomes. The preventive medicine connections show how Egyptian physicians' systematic attention to environmental health, community wellness, and early intervention strategies actually reflected sophisticated understanding of how preventing disease often proves more effective and less costly than treating established illness. The personalized healing wisdom demonstrates how ancient physicians like Egyptian mold therapy practitioners developed systematic approaches to individualizing treatment based on patient characteristics, environmental factors, and personal circumstances. Principles that contemporary precision medicine is rediscovering through genetic analysis and other sophisticated diagnostic approaches. The cultural healing preservation becomes increasingly important as globalization threatens traditional medical knowledge systems that contain therapeutic wisdom developed over centuries of systematic observation and practical application. Egyptian antibiotic therapy serves as a reminder that preserving traditional healing practices isn't just cultural preservation, but potentially crucial healthcare resource conservation. The teaching medicine evolution incorporates lessons from ancient healing traditions into contemporary medical education, helping new healthcare providers develop systematic observation skills, cultural sensitivity, and holistic thinking that combines scientific knowledge with wisdom traditions that have proven effective across centuries of practical application. The wonder medicine recognition emerges as people realize that some of the most important medical breakthroughs involve rediscovering and systematically investigating healing practices that traditional cultures developed through careful observation and practical necessity rather than theoretical sophistication. As you drift deeper into peaceful rest, the images of Egyptian temple physicians blur gently with modern laboratory researchers, all connected by the same fundamental commitment to systematic healing, careful observation, and compassionate care that transcends cultural boundaries and historical periods. The moldy bread that began this journey dissolves into golden light that represents humanity's timeless capacity to transform accidental discoveries into systematic healing wisdom, proving that the most important medical advances often emerge from combining ancient wisdom with contemporary understanding, practical necessity with theoretical knowledge, and individual healing with community care. The gentle rhythm of your breathing matches the eternal cycle of discovery and rediscovery that connects ancient Egyptian healers with modern pharmaceutical researchers, all participating in the ongoing human story of learning to heal ourselves and each other through systematic observation, compassionate care, and willingness to find medicine in the most unexpected places, even in moldy bread that someone else might throw away. Sleep now, knowing that healing wisdom flows like the Nile itself, sometimes underground and invisible, but always moving toward the light, carrying ancient knowledge into modern times, transforming accidental discoveries into systematic understanding, and proving that the capacity to heal and be healed represents one of humanity's most enduring and beautiful characteristics. And so our journey through the dusty corridors of ancient Egyptian medicine comes to its gentle close, like the soft settling of sand after a desert wind has passed. You've walked alongside physicians whose names we'll never know, watched them stumble upon discoveries that would echo through millennia, and witnessed how a simple accident with moldy bread became one of humanity's most important medical breakthroughs. As you settle deeper into comfort, let the images fade slowly. the warm glow of oil lamps and temple healing chambers, the careful hands of ancient physicians preparing their mysterious remedies, the satisfied sighs of patients whose infected wounds finally began to heal. These scenes dissolve now into the peaceful darkness behind your eyelids, carrying with them the profound reminder that healing wisdom can emerge from the most unexpected sources, preserved across centuries by careful observers who trusted their experience even when they couldn't explain the science. The moldy bread that started our story has transformed into something much larger, a symbol of human ingenuity, accidental discovery, and the timeless connection between ancient wisdom and modern understanding. Rest now in the knowledge that throughout history, healers have found medicine in unlikely places, guided not by perfect knowledge but by careful observation, systematic documentation, and the simple determination to help their patients feel better. Let your breathing slow to match the eternal rhythm of the Nile, that ancient river that witnessed these discoveries and carries their memory still. The Egyptian physicians sleep now in their eternal rest, but their legacy lives on in every antibiotic prescription, every carefully controlled clinical trial, and every moment when modern medicine rediscovers wisdom that was never truly lost. Sweet dreams, knowing that healing wisdom flows like water through time, sometimes hidden but never gone, always ready to emerge when careful observers pay attention to the world around them.